Welcome back, everybody, and I hope that you had a very relaxing and restful break. We certainly are excited about this next session that we're moving into. I believe that the link to the Vortex, which is mapping these sessions by our partner, Ugo Aruja, is pasted into the chat box, so you can follow the graphical representation of the conference as he develops that in real time. And he'll be doing the same for this session on value and circularity, our third out of 4 sessions for the day. And joining us today in this session will be Janez Potočnik, Evelyn Yonkhoff, James Quilligan, and Jean Russell. And to kick things off, we are announcing the release of our second blueprint from this year. We earlier released the Sustainable Finance Blueprint, and right now we are releasing the Value Cycles Blueprint. And so that is available on our website on the Value Cycles landing page, so you can jump over there. This is a foundation for this session, though, of course, this session travels further afield. And what we have in that is an introduction where we define value, and then we look at the various notions of value from shareholder to shared, ultimately ending up at our notion of system value. And then we look at the question of cycles from value chains and a linear idea through the circular economy and end up in the idea of a cyclical economy. We have many different recommendations included in that, and it is the culmination of a year of activity with a working group of about 40, some of whom are in this session itself. So, without further ado, we will move into our first speaker, Janez Potočnik, who will be speaking to us about system change and the European Green Deal that you started to hear about in the last session. So Janez, over to you.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be with all of you. So I should start probably saying good morning, good day, and good evening, because we are connected through practically all the world. As you have heard, I will speak about the system change implementing the European Green Deal in times of recovery. And I would like to apologize from the beginning because I will, due to other obligations, not be able to participate in Q&A later on. The first thing which I would like to share with you, that most important thing which all of us should remember, is that the first time in the human history, we actually faced the emergence of a single tightly coupled human socio-ecological system of planetary scope, which means that we are more interconnected and interdependent than ever. So our individual and collective responsibility has thus enormously increased. We can see that through the COVID crisis, or we have seen it before also through the climate change crisis. The Club of Rome has nicely developed its thinking by saying that before we have lived in empty world which was dominated by nature, and that we have now moved to the full world which is dominated by humans. In the empty world, it was labor and infrastructure which were the limiting factors of human well-being, while in the full world, it is natural resources and environmental sinks limiting factors of human well-being. What does that actually mean? It means that if you consider economic development in the future, you can't do it without ignoring natural and health consequences. In International Resource Panel, we have very much introduced behind the so-called decoupling concept, which means that, of course, we can develop in the future and also economic activity can grow. But all that should be decoupled from the resource use, and both should be decoupled from environmental impacts. This is pretty much the logic without which, taking into account also the human development and growth, we can hit the walls pretty quickly. And as you will hear also from my colleagues, we are basically close to that. So European Commission has announced the so-called European Green Deal. This was a communication already in December. But if you want to understand Green Deal in the right way, then you have to take into account everything which was adopted after that. Annual Sustainable Growth Strategy, Climate Pact, a new industrial strategy, Circular Economy Action Plan, everything linked to the digital documents, and recent Farm to Fork Biodiversity Strategy, and many more documents which are existing and coming. All that is actually European Green Deal. So what are the things which are important to remember? It's in a way introducing a new logic, new approach, and new political narrative. When I was member of the Commission, our narrative was growth and jobs. And believe me, I tried not only once to introduce just sustainable in front of the growth and jobs narrative, but I was not successful. What is also important is that the European Green Deal very well understands the importance of social considerations of the transition. You can do the right policy making, but if you do not take into account the social considerations, then it will not be successful in practice. So it's important to understand that the transition will actually fall or fly on the social story, which is very much connected to that. The general orientation is relatively simple. The most important message is that this is a new growth strategy. It's basically saying that for the first time from such a level, we got a message that environmental preservation, it's not in contradiction with economic development. And that's a very important message. It's also saying that it aims to protect, conserve, enhance the European Union's natural capital and protect the health and well-being of citizens from environment-related risks and impacts. This transition must be just and inclusive. It's also an integral part of European strategy to implement UN 2030's agenda and SDGs, and it's based on the circular economy, which we will look in the future to more in detail. So it's a promising start, but a long road ahead. But the most important is that in the first place, we are appreciating their work. What they need at this moment is a sincere help to fill some of the gaps identified. And let us focus now on circular economy as part of that and the importance of behavioral locks and value retention. Circular economy should be seen as an instrument to deliver decoupling of everything what I was mentioning before, as part of the bigger picture of economic, societal, and cultural transformation. Walter Stachel, one of great authors of the circular economy, nicely said, linear economy is like a river and circular economy is like a lake. If we would look to the proposal which was proposed by the European Commission, they have addressed sustainable product policy, key product value chains, less waste, more value, and also cross-cutting actions. So the whole document, it's pretty good. The only thing where I would really urge everybody to think is that we move from sectorial and product thinking to more system thinking. So it's not about batteries and vehicles. It's more about mobility, which you should talk about if you are serious in addressing all those issues. Two things on which I would like to draw your attention. Both are linked to underutilization and ownership. If we look at it from the angle of a producer, today the situation is such that producer is responsible for the product until it's produced, then it's consumer. At the end, when it's end of use, it's actually society. How it's organizing it, it's up to basically, it could go back to the private sector, whatever. It's society which is responsible. So the link between producer and the product which is producing is actually lost. I think what would be really important that this link is better established, because it would, for the producer to see the retained value in the product, for the producer to think about the design and the business models. If the products would, for example, end on his courtyard again, the design, the business models would look entirely differently. So I think it's very important to rethink the ownership and align incentives with regulation. If we are looking to the same question from the consumer's angle, we don't need cars, we need mobility, we don't need light bulbs, we need light, we don't need chairs, we need to sit, We don't need refrigerators. We need chilled and healthy food. We don't need CDs. We want to listen to the music. We don't need pesticides. We want healthy plants. And I can continue. So dematerialization, rethinking the ownership, moving from efficiency to sufficiency, it's for me quite essential way of thinking. What is the real problem in that? Preferences from consumers to own products, of course, like houses, like cars, like refrigerators, clothes, and so on. All that is driving consumption in a kind of massive lock-in in underutilization. And the way out, which I see, it's in young generation, which is less ownership biased, and in providing alternative options. So don't come to consumer with saying you should not do that and that. Rather provide him with alternatives which could give him a better way of how he can fulfill his needs. One example on the mobility system, European car, it's typically parked 92% of time, 1.6% it's looking for parking, 1% it's sitting in congestion, we are driving it only 5%. And if we take into account that in this 5% of driving, in the 5-seater, it's at average 1.5%, we are actually utilizing the car 2%. So if we would move from owing to sharing story, according to material economics, we can decrease the CO2 impacts by 70%, reduce the total cost of ownership for 77%, and externalities and cost to society for 74%. So to conclude, I think there has never been a better moment for Europe to move from the history of resource-driven imperialism into an era of responsible use of natural resources, mitigating its resource fragility, and strengthening preparedness and resilience. This would also clearly position European Green Deal and give it a real historic and also strategic weight. So if we look to the basic COVID lessons, I think there are 3 crises which we are facing. There are 2 acute health and socioeconomic crises, as of course economies have shut down, and a crisis with deeper roots, which is a chronic crisis of globalization and economic transformation needed. And the latter has been feeding, of course, climate change, income inequality, and it's rapidly leading also to massive unemployment. Some are saying that the world after COVID-19 will not be the same again. I'm afraid it will be very much the same, but we will hopefully understand it better. Very likely, the frequency and severity of health-related outbreaks, climate-related extreme weather events will in the future increase. We need to rethink the way we are managing our risks as individuals and collectively, as private companies and public policymakers, locally and globally. We need to build more resilient societies, and of course, we have to be better prepared. And by the way, precautionary principle, if you don't know, it's written in EU treaties. Maybe trying to better implement it in practice, it's not so bad idea. It can save our jobs if saving our lives is for somebody not enough. I do consider European Green Deal and the post-COVID recovery as 2 sides of the same coin. First, because the economic policy designed by Green Deal and related documents is the most convincing competitiveness policy of the European Union, which we are also searching now in post-COVID recovery. Because European Green Deal, through also circular economy, which is making dependence on imported materials and other natural resources and fuel and so on, with that we are in a way also addressing all those concerns which were COVID related, and some are calling for reconsidering globalization. It's also more about local jobs. Then both are talking about intergenerational solidarity and agreement. Why European Green Deal? It's actually a response to that we are indebting future generations in a way that we are basically that we are depleting natural capital. While when post-COVID, it's indebting them in monetary terms. In both contexts, I think it's vital that we don't leave it with the same world which we have created and offer them something better. Also, the COVID-19 is providing the necessary missing urgency in monetary terms, which before we have never seen in climate-related financial efforts, and both are calling for a new approach of governance, in particular on a global level, because these are common problems. So To end, as Johann Wolfgang Goethe said, and this would be my final message concerning the European Green Deal: knowing it's not enough, we must apply; willing it's not enough, we must do. Thank you for your attention.
Great, thank you, Yanez. In the shift over to Evelyn Jonkhoff, it may make sense, Yanez, since you do have to leave early, to just pose one question to you in the intervening time, if that is possible. Is that something that we can achieve technologically? And if not, we'll shift on to Evelyn and move on to a question to you if you're, okay, great. So Yanez, you've been talking about the European Green Deal, and that ties in our next section to the donut. And of course, the donut is defined by ecological ceilings and social foundations. So great. So Yanez, the question for you would be how the European Green Deal, in order to kind of make this transition to Evelyn, how the European Green Deal addresses issues of ecological ceilings and social foundations, such as those found in the donut.
European Green Deal is clearly addressing those issues and also pointing on them. It's explicitly mentioning that kind of logic and approach. In particular, when it comes to the Circular Economy Action Plan, this is also pretty clear and visible. So it's consistent. So the whole donut philosophy, the internal human needs and the external planetary boundaries, I think it's very much consistent with that logic. So living in safe operating space, living under conditions which are guaranteeing us that it's actually pretty much also logical with everything for what we are calling now in post-COVID recovery, that is resilient society, that is better preparedness. We can't be resilient, we can't be better prepared without taking those questions and messages into account.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Yanez. And so we'll use that as a transition to Evelyn Jonkhoff. Those of you who attended the conference last year will be familiar with at least the tee-up for this talk. Kate Rayworth spoke at our conference last year, and much of what she presented was on this at that time pending work at the city level with the city of Amsterdam. Well, fast forward 1 year and we actually have this implemented. And so we are particularly excited to have Evelyn Jonkhoff, who is with the city of Amsterdam and led the work on the Amsterdam Donut with us to present on that. So Evelyn, over to you.
Thank you so much, and good day to you all. It's an enormous privilege to be here and to have this unique opportunity to share with you the work we've done and I've been doing in Amsterdam in close cooperation, of course, with Kate Rayworth and her team, with Circular Economy and with C40 as well. As Janet's pointed out, it is clear that the only way forward is to move towards a circular and inclusive economy. And that starts with this goal that in Amsterdam, at the latest in 2050, we want to be fully circular and climate neutral. And that means that in a 10 years time, we have to reduce the amount of primarily resources that is used in our city with 50%. And looking at what we can do and the role we have to play and the instruments we have, of course, this powerful instrument of procurement. So just to name a few of our own objectives for the city administration, In 2022, so in a 2 years time, 10% of the city's procurement will be fully circular. We are also the owner of the land in our city. So the tenders in the built environment will be circular, fully circular, from 2023 onwards. That is all part of what we call different strategy elements. And in the heart of it is our Amsterdam circular strategy for the coming 5 years. And what is unique at this strategy is that it bridges two political terms, because in March 2022, we will have municipal elections. So it's a longer term strategy bridging two political terms. And that's translated into a very concrete innovation and implementation program with over 200 projects for this year and next year. I will come back to that later on in my presentation to show you the key elements of both the strategy and the program. And it's also, of course, crucial to monitor if we are on the right track. And as you know, everybody is searching for the right indicators, the right data to really monitor this complex transition towards a circular economy. It's about the system change and how to monitor that. But the starting point and also our ultimate goal is to realize a donut economy, to be donut city. So the work of Kate Raworth and her team was key in the development of our circular strategy, because you can only realize a circular economy if it is inclusive and if it is placed within the planetary boundaries. This is what we call the Orange or Amsterdam version of the model of Kate Raworth. I think you're all familiar with that. Staying within the planetary boundaries and at the same time strengthen social foundation so that everybody has access to this sweet spot, you could say, a thriving city, which is socially just and ecologically safe. Now I take you by the hand and very briefly show you, giving you more insight in the different elements. First, looking at our strategy. We're focusing on value chains, and as Janice clearly explained, not on batteries or cars or things, on value chains. So we're looking at the food and organic waste streams. We look at consumer goods and we look at the built environment. And for each of these three value chains, we've described an ambition for the coming 5 years in order to meet our goals for 2030 and 2050. When we look at the first ambition, we're looking at the beginning of its value chain, but we have the chance to change this value chain from a linear one to a circular one. So make short food chains, reduce consumption, looking at the development of our built environment in a circular way, which is a joint effort. And where we design our public space, where we design our buildings. The second ambition is looking at, say, the heart or the middle of the value chain, where we are using our food, and how can we do that in a healthy and sustainable way? How can we use our goods smarter and longer use those goods that are already in our hands and in our city? And that's also the same for the buildings we already have. How can we make sure that we use over and over again our existing buildings and maintain them in a just and circular way? It is in this time, and also I'm afraid in the coming years, that we still have to face the production of waste. So that's where the third ambition is looking at, is at the end of the value chain, where we still have waste, and how to bring this waste as a resource at its highest value back into the value chain, realizing closed loops. As we all know, we're at the beginning of this enormous transition towards a circular and inclusive economy. So we have many, many questions and very little answers. So our approach is learning by doing. We can't wait. We have to act now. And we do that in Amsterdam. on the one hand, top down, as a municipality, as a city, we can give the good example. We have to show the good example, and we have to indicate what we want to achieve. We have to share our ambition so that everybody knows what to do to realize that and to be part of this movement. And on the other hand, bottom up, looking at our cities, there are so many circular projects and initiatives. How can we combine them? How can we link them together in order to accelerate and scale up all those initiatives and to learn from it, to find more answers than the present questions have? That means in Amsterdam, when we look at the strategy, we have this 2-year, very concrete innovation and implementation plan with over 200 projects. Projects from all different colleagues and different departments throughout the whole city administration, because the whole city administration is linked and part of this movement. But it's also projects from the private sector, from citizens, from our research institutes. Only together we can realize this. At the end of 2021, we will of course evaluate all those projects and see what steps forward we have realized. How can we learn from it? How can we do it better in the next political term? So keep on track is crucial, of course, by carrying out all those projects in our city. And that means also that we have to find ways to measure our progress, to monitor this system change. So what we've done, we have developed a first framework with a lot of indicators, both on, say, the material side as well and the environmental side, as well as the social foundation. And that all together is say, the building up of our framework. And what this framework has learned us is that looking at the year 2018, when we calculated the use of materials in 1 year, that's related to an enormous production of CO2. When we look at the total CO2 emissions our city is responsible for, then 2/3 of the CO2 emissions are produced elsewhere, directly related to our consumer behavior, the use of goods in our city. So 1/3 of the CO2 emissions is directly related to the use of energy and transportation, so linked to the definition of climate neutrality. 2/3 of the CO2 emissions is caused elsewhere. So that means that we take up the responsibility, a responsibility that doesn't end at the city borders, but take the world into account. That's our scope as a responsible city. And that leads me to what's already mentioned, donut economics and the first city donuts. We are part, together with Portland and Philadelphia, of the C40 international research program called Thriving Cities, with a close cooperation with Kate Webers and her team and Circular Economy. We are the first city that published this kind of report, looking via 4 lenses to the impact we have, an impact on both the local and the global level, looking at social and ecological dimensions. And I will lead you through these 4 lenses by starting to say that the big 21st century question is, how can our city be a home to thriving people in a thriving place, while respecting the well-being of all people and the health of the whole planet? That's the key question for our city and for everyone. And in the last couple of slides, I will lead you very quickly through the 4 lenses. First, looking at the local social level with the key question, what would it mean for people of Amsterdam to thrive? And what we've done is looking at health, at connectivity, at enabling people and empowering people. So we combine the city target on all those different aspects with a city snapshot based on the year 2018 to see what our impact is on all those different aspects. And we did the same for the ecological impact we have on the local level. And the key question here is, what would it mean for Amsterdam to thrive within its natural habitat? What can we learn from nature? How does nature does it? And how can we work like nature? So what we've done here, when we look at the outer circle of the donut, we've translated that to all those different environmental themes and describe where we have a city target as well as a city snapshot to learn from it and to see what our impact is on the local level. And we take that up and bring it to the global level. Then the question is, what would it mean for Amsterdam to respect the health of the whole planet? And also looking at the same, say, environmental ceiling and all those different aspects. What you see here is that we weren't able to track it down to the city level. So here you see a description of a city target and sometimes also a city snapshot. But that's very important, and we have to develop this further on also with Kate and her team. But it gives a first impression of the overshoot we cause elsewhere. And looking at the global social level, then the key question is, what would it mean for Amsterdam to respect the well-being of people worldwide? And here again, you see the same as on the local level. The elements on health, connected, enabled, and empowered. And here we link it to the social development goals of the United Nations. How can we link these different SDGs to what we are causing elsewhere? And here you see a more global description. And in the coming time, we have to find more actual data also on the city level, because it's only in that way that we can really fulfill our responsibility to people here and everywhere in the world. Because this is what we are striving for, a thriving, regenerative, and inclusive city for all citizens, while respecting the planetary boundaries. Thank you very much for your attention.
Great, thank you very much, Evelien. And I would like to use this opportunity to remind folks, first off, great questions coming in. Thank you for targeting them to specific speakers. Also that we will be following up this with an interactive session with Salome Galliard, who's a colleague of Evelien's, as well as Tina Bossadine, from who is co-creator of the Maori donut that was mentioned earlier, with Martina Prox, our advocation partner, facilitating that. And this also gives me an opportunity to let you know that James Quilligan, who is up next, will be speaking in a breakout with Michelle Bowens. And so in some ways, recapping some of the conversation that both of them seeded at our 2018 conference. James also spoke at our Global Thresholds and Allocations Council meeting. And so we are very excited to hear what James has to say about redefining the notion of supply and demand. So James, over to you, please.
Thanks very much, Bill. I'd like to thank Bill and Ralph and all the other people with R3.0 for inviting me to this conference. I'd like to speak about the model of supply and demand and why it's broken and what we can do to fix it. So this is going to be a reflection on the state of macroeconomics today. And, you know, the basic paradox is fairly simple, and most of you know it, but it's a good way of introducing the topic. Today's economies are only growing by getting people to consume beyond their needs. And yet, by stimulating the economic demand of our expanding populations, we're overusing the planet's fixed amount of non-renewable resources. And we're not adequately replenishing Earth's renewable resources. As a consequence, money is being produced faster than nature can regenerate wealth. Sustaining renewable resources, as we know, is very challenging. But at the same time, we have to recognize that our planet consists of finite renewable resources on an extensive scale. In fact, the finite non-renewable resources far outweigh the renewable resources we have on the planet. And even though Earth is very rare in the universe as being a biological planet, non-renewables still dominate on this planet. And non-renewables can't be replaced by renewables. Sometimes we talk about how solar energy is going to substitute for hydrocarbons, for example. Yes, it can substitute for them, but it does not replace the basic elements in the hydrocarbons. And that's a key thing to realize. So all of this essentially calls for a review of the meaning of supply and demand, the way we've been framing it in the past. We're pretty much in agreement that market value is a very inexact approximation of the throughput of energy and matter from what R 3.0 is calling it the resource thresholds to the population allocations. And there's reasons for that, but to drill down to figure this out, we really need to go into the cardinal principles of economics, use value and exchange value, to look at this from a basic standpoint. The first law of thermodynamics says energy can't be created or destroyed. And in economic terms, that's been defined as use value. And use value essentially is the goal of seeking a needed commodity through the exchange of money, which results in the acquisition or consumption. The second law of thermodynamics we know is the law of entropy. All systems seek to be in equilibrium, which is why entropy is created, because there's a dissipation of energy in the universe. So things are winding down. It's interesting that the economic expression of this is exchange value. M in exchange value, the M is an initial investment of money, C is the commodity in which it's invested, and M is the return of the money plus an increase in its value. It's that increase that's interesting because, in fact, exchange value is really an inverse measure of entropy. You could think of entropy as value subtracted and exchange value as value added. And it's added through profit, interest rates, investment, inheritance, etc. We're pretty familiar with that. But we also know that as physical wealth increases, ecological debt is increasing. We see this in the emphasis on material efficiency, which is creating a loss of resilience. Increased productivity is creating system degradation. You know, when John Maynard Keynes invented the field of macroeconomics, he hit on something that was absolutely essential. He recognized that there was a correlation between inflation and unemployment. And to Keynes's great credit, he wanted to emphasize the demand side, not the supply side. So he proposed adjusting unemployment through government stimulus of labor. A few years later, William Phillips did the same thing, only on the supply side. He noticed that as wage inflation went up, unemployment went down. As wage inflation went down, unemployment went up. So this became a key indicator for central banks over the last 60 years, 70 years, 65 years, let's say, to adjust inflation through interest rates. And this has been the key tool in the toolkit of central banks. But the problem is it's begun to fail. In fact, it started to fail 50 years ago. in the 70s and 80s, there was high inflation and high unemployment. And in the 2010s, we've seen low inflation and low unemployment. The question is why? And this is very revealing. We can start to look at this as a situation that began about 1970, late 1960s, 1970, when the human demand for resources began to exceed what Earth can regenerate. So in that green space you see on the chart, all before that is representative of the entire history of humanity in its relationship with resources. So right around 1970 was the first time in the whole history of the world where the human demand for resources began to exceed the carrying capacity of the planet. And since then, we've been in that ecological deficit that you see in the red area on the right of the chart. Now, that was about 1970. And it's not coincidental that in 1971, President Nixon took the world off the gold standard, moving from a time of fixed exchange rates to a regime of variable exchange rates and floating currencies. The breaching of Earth's biocapacity by population demand for resources around 1970 resulted in the deregulation of the international monetary system in 1971. Now, this was a profound development, and it was exactly the wrong thing to do because it's perpetuating the growth of the deficit in our biocapacity on the planet. And we know that because when we hit on why the Phillips curve and Keynesian ideas really worked very well up until about 1970, that we understand from a broader perspective now 50 years later that wage and price inflation is fairly directly affiliated with resource thresholds, but we haven't developed measures for those, or at least they hadn't developed measures for that in the 1970s, but we're developing it now. Also, unemployment has a direct connection with population allocations. And again, that's just becoming more and more apparent today. So the big problem is that since the 1970s, central banks are no longer able to adjust inflation through interest rates. It is a huge crisis now in the banking world. It's a huge crisis in the international monetary system. Central banks are run out of instruments to work with because they're still not recognizing the broader equation between resource thresholds and population allocations. To explain this a little bit further, inflation is an increase in the rate of the circulation of money to adjust for a decline in the flow of energy through the economy. Unemployment is simply a measure of ecologically unsustainable consumption through capital accumulation. And this makes market value a pretty poor proxy for the real wealth of the environment. M prime is value added. And value added is the key culprit here because we're adding value at every stage of the economic dynamism. We're adding value at the level of extraction of resources, at their production, at their commerce, through investment, through distribution, through consumption, through waste. At every point, we're adding value. Adding value is not adjusting for entropy. We're draining energy from our ecosystems and dumping waste back into our ecosystems without returning a net energy gain to the environment. And what this means is that exacting negative net energy resources, when we do that, our economic debt has to be continuously paid by borrowing from nature, while we rationalize that it never has to be repaid. Dick Cheney was famous for saying deficits don't matter, and that's become a meme. But the fact is that $300 trillion in wealth is now being extracted from Earth's natural equity just to pay the world's monetary debt. So I don't believe that's correct, that deficits don't matter. because without a recognized feedback loop between money and ecology, market value is simply a measure of how indebted human beings are to the natural world. We're using up resource equity without restoring it. So the third principle, third law of thermodynamics is that no system can be without energy. It's not called negentropy as it used to be called. It's called syntropy. And the economic expression of this is distributive value, which is now becoming more and more known in the alternative energy and alternative economics world. Essentially, it means that the benefits of biomass, energy and mass, must reach everyone. There's a problem, however. There's still a polarization in science and economics because advocates of exchange value are minimizing the significance of biological regeneration, while the advocates of regeneration are minimizing the significance of physics and chemistry by emphasizing renewable resources over non-renewable resources. The problem is that supply side economics, as we know it, as Keynes said, the meme of that is that supply creates its own demand, so it becomes imbalanced. Production becomes more important than distribution. So what we're needing to do at the moment is to measure the distributive value of meeting human needs. We're going to have to measure the value renewed, not the value added. And this is really an important thing. So I'm going to run through for you four indicators that would provide a roadmap to this value renewed kind of system. Now, these are formulas that I'll be giving you, but they represent pretty abstract things of square roots and differential equations and calculus and other things, but I'm going to give it to you fairly simply. The first is carrying capacity. We're comparing the potential resources available in a locality with the needs of the population in that area. And distributive value is second. It's carrying capacity compared with actual resource distribution. And the third is a cap and lease index. And this gets closer to the circular economy because now we're withdrawing the non-renewable resources and comparing that with the conservation of non-renewable resources. The first step is capping resource extraction and the use of the commons. Then we save a percentage of the commons for future generations. Then we lease each commons to small businesses, cooperatives, or government utilities in the present and assess fees on the products from those commons that are spent on restorative management of each commons and basic income for the present generation. This is a system in which we're kind of creating a lockbox for these resources for the future. By capping a percentage of resources for the future, we're not only saving resources for future generations, but the reserve assets themselves become the basis for a sustainable standard of value. The signals for ecological availability of resources to meet the needs of all people are now conveyed directly through our money, not through the prices of goods that we buy. And lastly is purchasing capacity. That's what all of this leads to. A cap and lease index is compared with distributive value, and that whole thing is compared with the needs of the population. This is the rate at which the value of our money is adjusted to meet people's basic needs in line with the replenishment of resources. This is a system of value that is parallel to exchange value. It's not exchange value. It balances the material supply and demand of people today with the material supply and demand of people in future years, which we can calculate. We're moving from value added to value renewed because conserving non-renewable resources and replenishing renewable resources are actually two entirely different forms of value. Again, syntropy is the principle that is going to be operative in the future. It involves carrying capacity, distributive value, cap and lease index, purchasing capacity. And I would suggest that these measures provide a roadmap for integrating the fulfillment of everyone's needs now with the ecological conservation and regeneration that's necessary to meet these needs progressively into the future. And lastly, I just leave you with this aphorism that if you don't measure it, you won't sustain it. So that's why these kinds of measures are so critical at the moment. Thank you for your attention. It's been a pleasure to speak to you today.
Thank you, James. A lot of food for thought there. And thank you for the reformulation of, that's a Peter Drucker quote, I believe, of what you measure, what you measure is what you manage, and shifting that to what we can sustain. And this leads very smoothly into our final session on value and circularity. With Jean Russell talking about more thrivable value. So building on the concept of thrivability that Jean first articulated in 2012 or 2013, and that Michelle built on in the earlier session, applying that specifically to value. So Jean, over to you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you to my fellow panelists. Very stimulating discussion, I'm sure will follow. I want to start by just grounding a little bit in the reason that I am here today, which is to say I've been interested in thrivability since 2008. And I've been trying to figure out, what does that mean? What does it mean to thrive? What does that look like? And so in 2010, I worked with 60 some people to do a sketch of that. And then in 2013, we did a book that's called Thrivability Breakthroughs, talking about what are the innovations that we've had in the world that make a thrivable world more possible. I dug down into what do social organizations do for that in a book called Cultivating Flows in 2016. And then I started looking at, like, what does this mean to implement, and what are we missing that will make it possible? And so I worked on a project called Holochain and ended up running a startup called Commons Engine, where we were interested in data commoning, because I think it's really important what we're doing with the information and how we're bringing it together in order to be able to steer. So what is the compass, I think, is the question here. What is the compass that allows us to steer for a more thrivable world? And so I wondered, given the images that are pictured here, which one gives us a greater sense of thriving? And we know what thriving looks like. If you go out into the wild, you can see what thriving looks like. And I don't mean to demean the growth chart all that much. I think that it was the best that we could do with the amount of information that we could manage at the time. And so I want to look at, if we judge by money, how two-dimensional that really is. And it feels, as my friend Herman Wachter says, it feels like optimizing the temperature of the oven by the mathematical abstractions based on the electric use of the house. We could just be measuring the oven. But the electrical use of the house is what we were able to gather as we were looking at things like GDP and trying to create a more thrivable world then, right? I want to look back and say we were doing the best that we can with the information that we had available and the way that we could process it. So how do we do better? So here comes COVID-19, and we all across the globe learn a little bit more about carrying capacity. And it's added this dimension of context. Growth was always in a context, and we often obscured that in our little hockey stick charts. But now we can start to consider, growth within a context. What is the thresholds that this happens within? Which brings us to this fabulous notion of donut economics, right? Where we not only have carrying capacity within one context, but we have those concerns in relationship to another. We've added more dimension. And so the carrying capacity allows us to understand the ecological ceilings and the social foundation, both, as the presentation earlier discussed. And that's really the best we can do right now. And even that is really pushing our edges on what kind of information that we can gather together to be able to get a sense. And part of that has to do with the membranes that we're trying to sense within, because information has often been gathered inside a particular membrane, inside an organization. And to do it at the city level, we're having to add up and move between various membranes. So I want to develop a way for us to have a compass that allows us to see this carrying capacity indicators in relationship between membranes and over time, which I think would look a bit like this. Although this image is static, and I want you to picture in your mind instead the old aquarium screensavers that we have that you used to get kind of mesmerized by if you weren't working on your computer and you could see the fish moving around. And so if that is what our dashboard looks like, we can see the living system within its thresholds and over time, then we could have different indicators like each fish means something and the coral means something and the quality of the water means something. So if we're going to program that aquarium, each element, as I said, could be a donut in itself. And so a particular organization, a region within the city, whatever the membrane layers that we're looking for could have their own thresholds and be measured. And then the system could be seen also at a whole. Also, when we're looking at the system as an aquarium, then we get the sense of the interaction between these elements. Currently, the donut is not showing the direct correlation between the fish and the coral and the water quality. It's singular entities in a circle. And so we can simulate the system by having the fish swimming in schools where they're keeping X distance from each other. So these elements can be interactive and relational. So how do we build that system? Like, how do we, given what we have in the world today and the concerns that we hold, how do we get the data to build that aquarium? And so I looked at what are the concerns that block that. And one of the big ones is the sharing dilemma. Like, how do we share information? It's very hard to get organizations to share their information together. What is the accounting systems that we're using? What are we measuring and valuing beyond money that allow us to track these things in a way that we could say what the carbon emissions are? And then the agreement structures for the data trust, like how are we building a commons so that it's not corrupted by a single player? If a company like Walmart is running the data trust, it's going to skew the entire supply chain's behavior. And then how do we create lessons within our learning on how to improve our productivity within our capacity by creating deep learning so we can share those wins together. So when we find an efficiency that we can improve, we can make that a pattern in the system. So solving these problems, I looked at sharing safely. And this is one of the reasons that I was working on Holochain, was to look at agent-centric architectures rather than data-centric architectures. If you can think of data-centric as it's in a big spreadsheet and somebody owns and controls that spreadsheet, versus agent-centric, where each person contributing owns theirs and only shares the pieces that they want, that they've given permissioned access to, it means that everybody can share just their pieces and give a timeline for it. This data needs to renew every quarter. These people get this amount of access to this information, but I always own and control it. Then we're not facing a bunch of GDPR issues, and agents can control their own data, which makes it safer for them to be sharing it with each other. Then I'm interested in what is the accounting method that we're using in order to share more thick information, not just our accounts payable and debits and credits, but more about our business processes and the value chains so that we can have a better sense of what's happening and find those efficiencies, such as what are we doing with carbon emissions, which don't show up as debits and credits as money. And showing that flow of activity and who is involved and what events happen and what are the agreements around those events can happen in an REA structure. And REA is not a new accounting method. This comes out of the 80s, but it doesn't get implemented very much because of legacy data systems. And so I'm very curious to see, as we move to interorganizational multi-membrane accounting, if that enables this shift to a thicker accounting methodology that allows us to understand things like carbon emissions. And so then if we're using this new accounting method, how is that the agreement structure set up for that accounting to be shared with each other. And so I'm really interested in the efficiencies that can come from mutualization. And so I was talking to my colleague, Herman Wachter, and he gave this great example for us. He's been working on a project called Lean and Green for several years, which is interested in transportation and reducing carbon emission. And by analyzing the data across multiple companies, they were able to see that 2 trucks from competing companies were delivering books and magazines to different stores. And both of them were not really profitable. But because they were analyzing carbon, they were able to see that these not full trucks were both going to the same stores. And so the competitors agreed to cooperate on transportation, which both made them more profitable in the areas they wanted to compete on, which was the books and sale of magazines. And so this moving from competition to cooperation at the right layers, interorganizationally, I think is where there's a lot of opportunity for us to be moving forward together, living within our capacities, and at the same time improving our companies. So once you see the possibilities that happen here in an agent-centric world, how do we improve not just those 2 competitors, but larger things in the ecosystem, as I'm sure we're concerned about at the city scale. So we can find those patterns using something like AI. And I'm very concerned about AI in many contexts. Again, like I said with Walmart, we don't want to have some company coming in and profiting from us having shared our data. We want the ability to share that information and feel like we have a say within how that goes. And so being able to create AI on data that we own and have agreements with together, I think is really important for us improving these patterns together. And so I want to really thank Reporting 3.0, because I think there's a big piece in this sharing of information across the organizations and in our ecosystems that's going to require standardization of data. Because one of the things that's blocking that sharing right now is that organizations don't set up their information systems in the same way. And so I'm in the US and maybe we're measuring things in feet, and in Europe they're measuring it in the meters, and having to do the meshing of information and the calculations to make that data connect and make sense together is really important. And I think that the work that Reporting 3.0 is doing will help to standardize those so that we can do this interorganizational information sharing, so we can improve our productivity together while maintaining those carrying capacity thresholds. So thank you very much for having me here today.
Great, thank you very much, Jean. Thank you, James, Evelyn, and Yanez earlier. And we will move into our question and answer session now. We've got about a little bit more than 25 minutes. And we've been harvesting questions from the panel, from the participants. And we also have some questions of our own. So Ralph, over to you to voice the first questions from the participants.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. And we've been actually bundling a couple of questions together, which are addressed to Evelyn and have to do with, of course, the City Donut model. And Evelyn, there are questions that sort of reach 3 different levels. There was one question from Leonard Overkamp, who was excited by your presentation. And he was wondering or questioning if you believe it is possible to downscale the donut even more to a single company. So he's curious what you have to say about that. And in prolongation of that, David Kish was actually asking, well, does it not make sense in the City Donut concept, where most of the companies in any region are small and medium-sized companies, to even go dissolve it even further into micro enterprise networks? And that very much also coincided with a question from David Pendle, who said, well, he recognized that a zero waste enterprise in Amsterdam actually had to fold. He mentioned Zero Waste Lab, where he says it's potentially also due to the lack of support from the city. So how would you create and support resilient ecosystems when these cases occur. And then, so that was the part that was really going into the donut concept on very local level. And the other part is a question from Callum Reverend, who was asking, so how do you set the boundaries for Amsterdam's contribution and its allocation to the impact of the planetary boundaries? So that goes out of the question, out of the city donut concept. So those are bundles of questions, or a bundle of questions for you, Evelyn.
Thank you so much, and please help me to remember all the questions if
Sure.
I miss one in answering them. And thank you for all these say feedback, because it's also sharpens my mind to see where we are heading for and what we still have to learn. Looking at, say, the first questions around companies. Yes, of course. What we've you can also apply the donut economic thinking on every level, so also on the level of an individual company or a neighborhood. And last year, June, during our festival, We Make the City, we did actually that with around 100 representatives of all kinds of organizations and companies in working on their own donuts. And that means that you have to answer questions around who owns your company, what does your network looks like, how are you financed, what is your purpose, and then when you plot the answer on both, on the one hand, say the present linear economy, of on the other hand the circular economy, or the thriving economy, a thriving city, then you can see where you are now and what you need to invest in order to get not only your own organization, but a whole network in which you're part, to move towards this donut economy. So actually what it means in thinking and using the framework of donut economics is that it's helping you to balance between all those different aspects who are so interlinked. And you can answer those questions on every level. And also, it's interesting to see if we are able, as a city organization itself or a city administration, to answer those questions. So yes, it is. I think it's challenging and inspiring to do that on every level. Can you help me with the other questions, and hopefully our answer was enough.
There was the question. Yeah, there was the question around that practical case, which was recognized Zero Waste Lab, which folded in Amsterdam, and it was assumed that it was due to a lack of support from the city. So how can you really, be resilient in these multiple stakeholder environments to really keep those labs up and running?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I personally admire Zero Waste Lab. And to look at the actual situation, we're still supporting Zero Waste Lab, because Zero Waste Lab is also one of the projects within our innovation and execution program. And at the same time, it's challenging to see also from a city administration perspective to oversee this whole complex ecosystem and to make sure that everyone has access to this transition. And so Zero Waste Lab and all those other initiatives is also questions around how can we combine them and make sure that they can survive in itself as well. And we also have to be critical with every initiative in our city. What could or should be the role for us as a city administration? What role can we play, and how can we support in the best way to make sure that this kind of initiatives will grow and thrive in our city? And Zero Waste Lab is one of the great examples in our city.
Okay, thank you, Evelyn. And Bill, over to you with more questions for the other speakers.
Great, thank you, Ralph, and thank you, Eveline. So James, you first, and of course, I think that these presentations really dynamically interact with each other incredibly well, but just starting with you to go in order. One question came from Lucian Harlow Dion, just for examples of distributive value, very interested in that concept. And then I'm gonna build on top of that to factor in some questions that came in the other sessions. So you mentioned the quote that deficits don't matter. And that's in essence what the Stephanie Kelton and the proponents of modern monetary theory are proposing. We had Jason Hickel suggesting that the modern monetary theory can reconcile with the idea of ecological limits. And yet you're saying that, you know, using resource equity without returning it, if I got your phrasing right, actually does not, it's an inflation of debt that is not actually abiding by the ecological origins of that. And thereby potentially, you know, crossing that vital carrying capacity. So I guess that's a bundle of questions, and then I may have one follow-up before moving on. So over to you, James.
Sure. Let's take your last issue first because it's fresher in our minds. Well, so MMT is a fairly new concept, but you can see that it builds on Keynesian thought, and it's the idea that deficit spending is a legitimate practice. You know, to unpack this would take me 6 hours to explain why my position on this, but just in brief, MMT is, if we're taking seriously that the computer-driven algorithms that show that fiscal deficits can be increased in proportion to the needs of the population, and there's no concern over that. Really, it only takes a moment's reflection to see what it's doing to the environment, that the debt in nature is linked to monetary value. And that's not going to be reconciled by government fiscal budgets. Not going to happen that way. It's a structural problem, and it's a deep structural problem. Has to do with the way all of our systems and institutions are set up. So, in fact, yeah, there's more to say about that, but that's the quickest explanation. In terms of examples of distributive value, well, let's think about this right now. Is the marketplace actually measuring distributive value? No, it's not really. We have distribution systems. There are distribution chains that exist, and the fact is that the measurements of distribution stop at the point of sale. So in other words, what we are measuring as demand right now is how much money a person's willing to pay when they buy something, a good or a service. And so that's a market value that has to do with the measurement that the economy now uses as a proxy for demand. There are, you know, market assessments of that take place to ascertain the needs of consumers and things like that, and that's not a form of distributive value. Distributive value essentially is the extent to which the needs of people are being met, and that means all people. It doesn't mean, it's not a kind of per capita indicator. It's an actual measure of the distribution of resources. How effective is it? And that is not being done on any scale. And it certainly isn't being done on a scale that's commensurate across the board. So any meaningful look at the regeneration of resources is actually going to have to include the distributive component. In fact, the only way we're going to get to a more demand side economics rather than supply side economics is to accentuate distributive value. So there are lots of minor examples of it that exist. You know, distributive value is something that you could say in one way that FedEx and Amazon and many of the commercial distributors are actually very much focused on. That's certainly a wave of the future. But right now, the important thing is to look at how utility supply chains like water systems, water and sewer systems, electrical generation, how can those be better community owned? How can we get collective management over it so it doesn't have a monopoly generating those distribution sources? So what I'm saying is that it's a work in progress. Distributive value is not being done right now, and distributive projects are not really being rolled out to the extent that they should be. This is a great frontier, and it's going to move people. One of the things that's going to move people away from supply side to demand side economics.
Okay, great. Thank you, James. And that's actually, again, a good lead into the questions for Jean. In particular, Jean, you also focused on the question of carrying capacity. And thankfully for us, associated that with the notion of context, which speaks the language of R 3.0. But we're really, I was most fascinated by your focus on membranes, and in a sense, sort of how membranes can define this notion of scaling. So that the membrane could be, we've talked a lot about downscaling, not just in the way that Kate Rayworth is using it is from the macro level to the micro level. But in the earlier session, there was talk about downscaling being synonymous with degrowth in a sense. But if we use it in this notion of these membranes, I'm wondering, how does that work in practice, particularly maybe in a digital ledger technology or blockchain instance? And in particular, this notion of having a data commons mirrors the real world commons that we have. And of course, it's in order to protect those real world commons that we would apply the notion of carrying capacity. So I guess I'm asking, I hope it's not too convoluted a question, but how this question of carrying capacity and membraned scaling interacts with your notion of data commons.
Yeah, okay, great. I should have suspected you would ask about membrane stuff. So I'm using membranes rather than boundaries because of the semi-permeable membrane idea of a cell, right? Like what goes in, what goes out. And so looking at systems not as closed systems, because even if the resources, the physical resources are within the system, there might be things that flow out that are social and services, et cetera. So the permeability of a membrane is important. Also, my work is heavily grounded in Nilofer Merchant's work on the social era, where she's saying, we need to break our organizations out of these concrete, what's inside the organization, and start to include things that are beyond the boundaries of the organization. And so there's this permeability that ends up in the membrane of organizations as we try and capture value out in the social space. And so my attraction to membranes has to do with that. Then when we look at distributed ledger technology, the way those things get set up, at least in the holochain ecosystem, is that I've got my own string of data that I'm collecting, but I'm participating with a group of others. And so that becomes another membrane, and it's hard-coded into the software how these membranes are working. So I'm on an app, I've got my own data, that's my membrane I'm controlling. I'm in a group, I'm sharing information with that group that I've given permission to share. And then how does that happen with larger and larger groups of groups interacting in networks of networks? And so, or I might be participating in multiple membranes, whether it's the company and my community and my nation, the way that we're managing those membranes. It's important to me that we're not fixating on the legal structure of them. We're not fixating on the scale of them. We're fixating on instead the permeability and what does it mean to be in exchange inside and outside. So have I answered most of the question? I feel like there was a part 3 that I didn't get to.
Yeah, and actually, you've led right up to that. This notion of permeability of a boundary or threshold, of course, in some ways butts up against the notion of carrying capacity or tipping points, where there's a kind of non-permeability or a hard edge to it. And so, in some ways, is it? Are we sometimes when these terms like a membrane is used, it's used metaphorically, and I'm thinking of an instance for those who are geeky enough, like a Markov's blanket or the notion of autopoiesis, where it's not simply metaphorical, but it's actually sort of a literal instance. And so I guess the question is, how does this permeability butt up against or dynamically engage with the non-permeability of, say, an ecological tipping point or other carrying capacities?
Right. So I wouldn't say membrane around something that's fixed, like the amount of aluminum on the planet, and instead would say, when the limits to growth came out, there was this big concern about, we're going to run out of the materials to make cars. And what people did was they found different ways to make cars. And so it minimized the materials. And so how do we come into collaboration with each other so that we can find those ways of being productive within those limits, right? This should be an exciting, creative opportunity to work within thresholds so that we can manage those flows. I'm also tentatively having little conversations with James around, like, can we have currencies that actually have different behaviors based on the resource? So if we're talking about something that's finite, the currency needs to be quite finite. And if we're talking about something that's partially rival, then that needs to be taken into account. What's the rate at which it gets renewed should be reflected in the way that we're accounting for it. Where things that, like an idea that's easily shared and actually can get better because it's being shared, might have a different kind of economy on it because it's moving between membranes quite easily without any lack or need to have friction. So it's an exciting space, and we're not there yet, but I do want to acknowledge there are real thresholds and limits, and that's different than what I would say is the permeability of a membrane.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jean. And maybe that does set up a kind of reverse question order back to James around the monetary issue, and then ending with Evelyn. And then we do have sort of a set of questions that are coming in from the audience. But I just want to use this bridge immediately, James, for you to maybe just talk very briefly about your sense of monetary theory or monetary currency that is able to make this direct tie into the ecological debt, if you will. Is there a way to sort of make that tangible in participants' minds?
To make it tangible in the participant's mind? Do you mean
for listeners?
A way of understanding it, or what my view of the whole field is?
No, just a tangible example of monetary. What is money that is reflective of these ecological debts? Is the gold standard essentially what you're calling for? It sounds like it's slightly different than that, because it isn't gold. It's actually the what we might call critical capital that is creating the notion of value, or the capital that needs to be preserved. I guess I'll ask quickly, is that an accurate understanding that it's essentially what's what's beyond carrying capacity is what we need to preserve, and therefore that's what creates the value. Am I articulating that right?
Well, I would make it simple by just saying that the focus on non-renewables is the key to this. So we're very focused on renewables, but we have to recognize that they're potentially renewable, and that has its own set of problems. The non-renewables have their own set of problems, and a monetary system moving into the future. A lot of people are focused on, the regenerative aspects of technology to map out regenerative economies. And Silicon Valley is, looking at that, and others are looking at it. But if you look at the history of economics, it's always based on something is scarce, like gold, as you mentioned. But certainly, we're not going back to a gold standard, although some people are pushing for it. The international monetary system at the moment is in complete chaos, and they're not letting it out that they're nervous, because then they would be able to run on banks, and then the whole system would collapse. The system will collapse eventually because it's because of this connection between economic debt and ecological debt. The two things are so intertwined, and we have no measurement system for it. And the central bankers do not want the word to get out, because once people make the connection, then they realize that their empire is going to be gone. Their empire of making money off of interest rates. Okay. So the key point that I'm getting at, Bill, is that the first the international monetary system is nowhere near this understanding, although they're entertaining some of these ideas, because they're recognizing that something has to change, and they don't really have a backup plan for the current system, not a meaningful one. And then secondly, they understand that MMT is not workable. And I know that firsthand. But besides that, MMT wouldn't drive a monetary system anyway. Your question is basically, essentially, that what is going to be the value behind money in the future? And I would just suggest that money needs to be something that, when we understand its purchasing capacity, we look at the value of money and we translate that into how much that's going to buy us. The signals of sustainability need to come through your currency value, not through prices. Because if it comes through your purchasing capacity and what you're capable of buying, if the value is low, then you might hold off on buying or investing or spending on something that you're interested in one day. And if the value is higher, you might then be more tempted to make a purchase. So the signals need to come through. The signals of sustainability need to come through our money, not through the pricing system. Okay. And but beyond that, and there's a lot of detail that I probably shouldn't go into here.
Okay, thank you, James. And this actually tees up a final question, and it'll start with Evelyn, and we'll see if it can go to others. But essentially, there's real interest in a question from our advocation partner, Jesse Hinshaw. And I'll paraphrase it in the sense that there is this relationship between sort of the downscaled idea of a city, or even an enterprise within that city, but then there's also the upscaled of these are all operating within systems. So in some ways, this is sort of a connection to the question of, how does Amsterdam and a city donuts perspective account for the fact that all of this activity towards a circular economy, for example, is happening within the context of larger systems that are often dysfunctional, such as our global economic system. So how do you make that link back up to the global?
Wow, that's a question. Hopefully I have a bit of a first answer, and start my thinking. So I will also take that question back to my city and to my team. Yes, and hopefully I understand the question right. Of course, we are part of this greater system, and I think using the methodology of donut economics makes us aware of the role we have to play as part of this bigger system. And of course, there were all kinds of players who are influencing in a negative way the impact, and how can we count that back to what we do in our city. I think we don't have the answer yet. But I think the starting point is that if we take up as a city our own responsibility, trying to influence others in the say the global network or the global ecosystem, I think that that's the start of making things change. And also, Jane, when you speak about the example of the two trucks who have the same kind of goods and are both not very good at their business case, and if you combine this, so it's also about being transparent, getting the right data, and starting this kind of conversation, and use the position of a city where everything comes together in a city. So use the position of a city and the insights we have by using this model to see how far we can get by using our influence to change also the global value chain. I do hope that's a bit of an answer, but I think it's a very complex question, and I think we're at the beginning of understanding the complexity of it.
Great. Well, thank you, Evelien, for taking that first response. And as a reminder, we do have a follow-up session where your colleagues will be available to go deeper on that question. And all of this is intended to spur an ongoing conversation in our 3.0 network. So I want to thank our 4 panelists, the 3 of you who were present now. Of course, James and Jean, you will be appearing in the breakouts in subsequent days on Friday early. So we look forward to seeing you back here. Evelien, thank you very much for being here today. And thank you to the participants for all of the great questions. We are tracking these questions. And so those that, there are loose ends for them, we will continue to follow those both in the breakouts. And if they don't get answered there, we will continue to pursue things outside of that. So we will invite everyone to continue on with a mindful movement session. For those of you who have been doing it, I have been doing the 2 sessions so far, and I have found it very useful for my ability to stay present by participating in this mindful movement that is facilitated by Jennifer Diana Nucci. So we will kick off right now with moving into this mindful movement session, and we will reconvene for the final plenary on governance and education an hour from now, so at the half-hour mark. So we look forward to handing it over to you, Jennifer.